Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for KitGuru, and the leaks were right. Today we can present our review of the nvidia GeForce GTX 1660 Super. So, as you will probably have seen, there's actually no reference card or Founders Edition or anything like that. So instead today we are focusing on two aftermarket cards. We have the Gigabyte 1660 Super Gaming OC 6G, and then from Palit we have the 1660 Super Gaming Pro OC. If you haven't already heard, 1660 Super is basically the same exact thing as the original 1660, but with one key difference, and that is instead of using 8 gigabits per second GDDR5 memory, it is instead using 14 gigabits per second GDDR6 memory. So that gives a improved memory bandwidth up from 192 gigabytes per second all the way up to 336 gigabytes per second. Other than that single change, however, the actual GPU used for the 1660 Super is identical to that used of the original 1660. That means it is the same TU116 GPU, again using the Turing architecture but with no RT cores or Tensor cores, and it also has the same configuration with 20 SMs and 1408 CUDA cores, so there's been no actual changes to the GPU itself for 1660 Super. I did also mention there is no reference card for the 1660 Super, but nvidia did release reference specs where the boost clock is rated at 1785 MHz. So these two cards here I have are factory OC models, with the Palit having a rated boost clock of 1830 MHz and the Gigabyte card upping that to 1860 MHz boost. Now, as for pricing, the 1660 Super has an MSRP starting at £209.99 for those of us here in the UK. That puts it just £10 above the MSRP for the 1660, while the original 1660 Ti has an MSRP of £259, so that's £50 more expensive. Both cards I do have here are factory overclock models, so I would expect them to come in a bit over the MSRP, but at the time of filming I don't actually have confirmed prices for either of these cards. But speaking with Overclockers UK, they are expecting prices to be more like £219 to £229, but like I said, we're just going to have to wait and see when we get official prices through. But anyways, that is pretty much it for our kind of introduction or preamble to 1660 Super, and we're now going to dive straight into the gaming performance. It is worth saying that with our results here, that the figures for the 1660 as well as the 1660 Ti do come from factory overclock cards, so we're not actually testing, reference clock 1660 or 1660 Ti, but considering we do have factory overclock models for the 1660 Super, it does make it a fair comparison. It's just worth bearing in mind that the results are probably going to be, a couple percent higher than they would be if we were testing just stock clocked cards. But with that out of the way, probably the most obvious comparison when looking at the new 1660 Super is going to be how the card stacks up against the original 1660. And like we said, it's just the memory change, so honestly I wasn't sure how much of a difference that was actually going to make. However, if we do dive into the performance figures now, we can actually see that the Gigabyte is running 14% faster than our 1660 on average, and for the Palit it is 13% faster on average, so that is definitely a decent step up from the original 1660 with just the memory changed. As you would have been able to tell from those charts as well, when you add an extra 12 or 13% performance to the 1660 with the 1660 Super, we are getting a card that performs very close to the 1660 Ti. In actual fact, I found the Gigabyte and Palit cards to run just 2 and 3% slower respectively than our 1660 Ti, so those are very small differences, really not enough at all I don't think to make an actual meaningful difference to your in-game gameplay, so definitely pretty much exactly the same experience with the 1660 Super versus the 1660 Ti. At this point in the video as well, it is worth saying here we are just focusing on our 1080p results, but if you do want to check out our 1440p and even our 4K charts, you can head over to kitguru.net where you'll be able to find that data. Moving on with a few more comparisons though, it's also worth looking at how the 1660 Super stacks up against some AMD cards. So up against the RX 590, we found that the Gigabyte 1660 Super is 18% faster on average, whereas the Palit 1660 Super is on average 16% faster than the RX 590. Vega 56, however, is still a tier ahead of the 1660 Super, where we saw these cards come in 12 and 13% slower respectively, with the Gigabyte being just the little bit faster of the two 1660 Supers. So then, looking at the bigger picture, simply changing the memory from G5 to G6 on the original 1660 is enough to give the 1660 Super basically the same levels of performance as the 1660 Ti. Yes, it is marginally slower, but really I have to say that the actual gameplay experience is going to be basically the same. For me, that makes the 1660 Super card that is probably better suited to 1080p gameplay, where in actual fact, for most of our titles, you would be well suited to gaming with a high refresh rate monitor. You will also get some mileage out of a 1440p monitor, but certainly in the more demanding titles that we test with, you would definitely need to drop kind of the image quality down a bit, as we did see frame rates dip into the 40s and 50s. So for me, 1660 Super is best suited to a 1080p gaming experience. We will continue to do some further testing looking at our temperature and acoustic results for both of these cards here, but first it is taking a quick look at the overall shroud designs and also the layout of the PCB and the heatsinks. So starting with the Gigabyte Gaming OC 6G, this is actually the same exact card as we saw when we reviewed the 1660 Ti Gaming OC 6G. So what that means is we have a triple fan cooler where each fan is 80mm across, and the shroud is mostly black plastic, so there's no metal here, but there are also some grey accents as well, just to give it a little bit more interest, but overall it is a very colour neutral design. It does also come fitted with a full length black backplate, but this is made of plastic, so it won't give you the same kind of premium feel as a metal backplate, but I would still rather have it than not, just for the extra structural rigidity, and it can also provide some protection if you have like a leaky all-in-one cooler, for instance. On top of that, we do also have some simple RGB lighting on the card. There's just one zone on the front side of the shroud where the Gigabyte logo lights up, so definitely not kind of the most bombastic RGB implementation I have seen, but again, this is up to personal preference and I would rather have it than not. We can also see that power requirements are a single 8-pin PCIe power connector, and then as for display outputs, we get 3 display ports and then 1 HDMI. Internally, the PCB is again identical to the 1660 Ti Gaming OC 6G, which means we have a 4+2 phase VRM for the GPU and then the memory, and we can also see that the new G6 memory does indeed come from Micron. Lastly, we can also get a look at that TU116 GPU, which is identical to that of the original 1660. As for the heatsink, this is comprised of 3 separate fin stacks, and these are connected by 3 6mm copper heat pipes. These heat pipes actually make direct contact with the GPU die, but we can see that there is a separate plate for the VRAM chips, and we can also see another couple plates for the VRM cooling as well. As for the Palit card, this one is definitely a little bit dinkier. It's just a dual fan cooler with 2 90mm fans, and we can again see a black plastic shroud. That being said though, I'm not too keen on the glossy plastic that Palit has used for some sections on the front of the shroud. In my opinion, it just kind of gives it a slightly cheaper overall look, but this is obviously subjective, and it's not like you're going to see it once the card is installed anyway. As per the Gigabyte card, there is again a full-length backplate here, but it is made of plastic. So still, like I said, I would rather have it than not, but it's definitely not as premium feeling as a metal backplate. In terms of lighting on the card, there is no RGB here, but we do have a white LED strip just kind of underneath the GeForce GTX logo on the front side of the shroud, and we can also get a look at the 8-pin PCIe power connector, while our video outputs come from 1 DisplayPort, 1 HDMI, and then 1 DVI port. Internally now, Palit is using a 3+2 VRM design, 3 phases for the GPU, 2 phases for the memory, and again, that memory comes from Micron. The cooler is a little bit more interesting though, as Palit has kind of gone with a single plate for both the memory, the GPU, as well as the VRM, so that's definitely a little bit more unusual. This is cooled by a single aluminium fin stack, and we can see that Palit is also using 2 copper heat pipes. So that is pretty much it for our quick look at the cards themselves. As for how they perform in terms of temperatures, I think it's probably no surprise to see that the Gigabyte card does run slightly cooler, with the GPU peaking at just 64 degrees. That being said, it's not like the Palit is actually that much hotter at all, with the GPU there peaking at just 65 degrees, so there's only 1 degree difference between these two cards. The Gigabyte definitely benefits most from its larger heatsink and triple fan design when we get to the noise levels. That's because we saw the card produce around about 40 decibels of noise under load, which is a very good result, and that makes it about 4 decibels quieter than the Palit, which peaked at around 44 decibels. I wouldn't say that the Palit is a loud card, but it is definitely noticeably louder than the Gigabyte here, so if you do prefer a quieter card, then the Gigabyte is probably the one to go for. Power draw does definitely favour the Palit card, however, as we saw it draw almost 30 watts less than the Gigabyte Gaming OC 6G. Initially, I thought that must just be the Gigabyte having a higher power limit, which might benefit when we come to manually overclocking, but in actual fact, both cards overclock pretty much as well as each other, with the cards averaging around 2070 MHz on the GPU core once we had dialed in our GPU offsets. In actual fact, I could push the memory further on the Palit card, where we saw an extra 900 MHz could be added to the G6 memory, whereas for the Gigabyte, I could only add an extra 725 MHz. Overclocking both these cards saw our average frame rate increase by around 7 to 8%, with a similar margin of increase for our 3D Mark scores. So again, that is pretty typical of our GTX Turing cards we have seen in the past. Overall then, while 1660 Super may not be an especially exciting product launch, it is definitely good news for the consumer. Using the same exact GPU as the 1660, but now with G6 memory instead of G5, we are essentially getting 1660 Ti levels of performance, but now for £50 less. That means 1660 Super is a good 13 to 14% faster than the original GTX 1660, and I'd say if you have been hanging on to a GTX 1060 for a couple of years now, the 1660 Super is definitely a worthwhile upgrade, as you should see performance improvements of around 41 or 42%. Up against the competition, well, there isn't really a direct competitor to these cards from AMD, or at least not yet. RX 590 is about 14 to 15% slower than the 1660 Super, so it's definitely a tier below. And there is Vega 56, but again, that's about 15% faster than the 1660 Super. But availability is definitely becoming more and more scarce for Vega 56, and I think also at this point in 2019 it is becoming a lot harder to recommend the older kind of power hungry Vega architecture. So that definitely makes it easy to recommend the GTX 1660 Super. It is going to offer best value if you can pick up a card at that £210 MSRP, but at that price I think it has definitely eliminated the 1660 Ti, and the original 1660 is only going to be worth buying if you can find it with a hefty discount. As with the 2060 and 2070 Super launch, I can imagine that anyone who bought one of the original Turing 16 series cards like the 1660 or the 1660 Ti is likely to be pretty annoyed that there has been a replacement, not even 9 months on from the initial launch of the 1660 Ti, so I can definitely understand if you are a bit annoyed. That said, there is no getting around the fact that the 1660 Super is offering the consumer better value, and it's a better overall product than what you would have got last week if you were spending the same amount of money. So with that said, it is definitely a recommendation from me for the 1660 Super. If you like this video, you can give us a thumbs up. Also leave a comment down below. Do let me know what you think about this card, and are you going to buy one? You can also subscribe if you haven't already. If you like this t-shirt I've been wearing, feel free to check out our merch, which is linked in the description below. And lastly, if you'd like to join our Discord server, that is also linked down below. Until then though guys, I'm Dominic 4Kit Guru, and I will see you in the next video.